Say my name.
Why did I say Cregg? Say it. I'm sorry.
Daniel Cregg.
That is
Yes, Daniel Craig.
a subtle difference,
So Daniel Cregg says the difference between Craig and Cregg is not subtle, but I argue that it is subtle, and in this video I'm going to prove it with what I believe are good, logical, and linguistically scientific reasons. And for a fun little experiment, feel free to write down if you think the difference is or is not subtle right now before you watch the video, and then at the end, let us know if the arguments swayed you at all. So first things first, there are many different ways to pronounce this name, whether you're in England, America, or anywhere else that speaks English or even another language. There are tons of different accents and dialects. We do not all pronounce it the same or just one of two ways. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to look at what I call Cregg version 1, which is the way Daniel Cregg pronounces his own name, and Cregg, which we'll call version 2. The reason I'm sticking with those two is because they are probably the most common that you're likely to hear, and they're the two specifically mentioned by Daniel Cregg in the talk show. But because the man himself only pronounces his name one way, we can kind of think of version 2 as being a proxy for any of the other pronunciations that are not Cregg version 1. So where do we start? What is the actual difference going on here? If I were to write it down with the International Phonetic Alphabet, version 1 would look like this, Craig, and version 2 would look like this, Cregg. So the first reason I'm going to argue that it is a subtle difference is because it's a minimal pair. Every other sound in the word is pronounced the same. You have ka followed by followed by a vowel, followed by ga. That is the same in both pronunciations. The only difference is that one vowel in the middle. By saying it is subtle, I'm not saying it is the same or I can't tell the difference. I'm just saying that it's similar. One of the special things about human language is that we can distinguish subtleties. How many of you have a dog that's trained to the word treat? And you say something like, oh, there's a big tall tree outside, and they think you're saying treat. It's because the dogs cannot differentiate those subtleties, but humans can. And just because we can tell the difference and we know that they are in fact distinct, doesn't mean that it's not still subtle. I like to compare this to a color spectrum. Anyone who's not colorblind probably has no issue telling apart these two colors. They are clearly distinct. But if you look at their position on a color spectrum, then you'll see that they're actually pretty close together. There's not a whole lot that actually differentiates them. In fact, most of our languages probably only have one word for this color, and we might just consider them different shades or light or dark versions of the same color. And while they are still clearly distinct, there are many more positions that are even more distinct, but not so many possibilities for things that are less distinct. Which brings me to my next point. The only difference between Cregg version 1 and Cregg version 2 is that one vowel in the middle, and the difference between those two vowels is minimal. Almost any other two vowels would have been more distinct from each other than these two are. And similar to a color spectrum, we can visualize this on an IPA vowel chart, which itself is also kind of a spectrum. For those unfamiliar, we use these positions to mark where in the mouth a certain sound is pronounced. The higher up means it's a more closed sound, so your tongue is higher or your jaw is more closed. So of course, towards the bottom means that your mouth is more open when you pronounce it. Symbols to the right are pronounced more towards the back of the mouth, while symbols on the left are pronounced more towards the front. When you see two symbols next to each other around a single dot, that means the one on the right is rounded, which simply means your lips form a round shape, and then the one on the left is unrounded. But both the vowels in Cregg version 1 and Cregg version 2 are unrounded, so we don't need to worry about that for this video. By the way, if you've made it this far into the video, you're probably interested in linguistics, so consider subscribing to see more. So if we look at the vowels from Cregg version 1, which we'll call vowel 1, and then the vowel from Cregg version 2, which we'll call vowel 2, you'll see that they're right next to each other on the IPA chart because they are pronounced in almost the exact same way, only slightly different, and there's not even another vowel in the intermediate space to distinguish them. They're both mid-front unrounded vowels, so if you're pronouncing Cregg version 1, all you have to do is open your mouth just a slight bit more on the vowel and it becomes the vowel 2. These two vowels are more similar to each other than almost any other vowel on the chart. And it's important to remember that, again, this chart is basically a spectrum or a gradient. You can pronounce anything anywhere on this chart. It doesn't have to fit neatly into one of these symbols. These symbols are just placed there for convenient reference points for study. What that also means is that some people's vowel 1 might be a bit more like a vowel 1.3, and then some people's vowel 2 might be really more like a 1.7. In some accents, vowel 1 and 2 might be so similar to each other that people who grew up without these sounds in their native speech might not even be able to hear the difference. In fact, in the Dutch language, the equivalent of vowel 2 is usually slightly more open than it is in English. And if you compare that vowel with the slightly more open vowel a, for English speakers, those are distinct vowels, but a lot of Dutch speakers can't really tell the difference, even if they have been studying English from as young as 5 years old. That exact scenario, as well as why people can't pronounce or can't even hear the difference between certain sounds, is explained in a lot more detail in the video tagged in the corner. But even for those of us who can easily tell the difference between vowels 1 and 2, they're still so close to each other that linguists have not felt a need to add another vowel in between them, because anything that is pronounced somewhere in between these two can usually be categorized as just one or the other. Now, there are some caveats. The IPA chart definitely can get a lot more detailed and show more symbols, but those are usually pretty rare or for allophonic variations and not fully fledged phonemes. For most people, we don't need to go into that much detail. So they're both mid-front unrounded vowels with, at least in English, no other significant vowels in between them. But there is one other characteristic of vowel 1 that makes it different from vowel 2. And Daniel Cregg himself said it here.
It's a diphthong.
A diphthong is a vowel that starts with one sound and ends up with another, in contrast with a monophthong, which stays the same. But both diphthongs and monophthongs can only form one syllable. They take the same amount of time to say as any other long monophthong vowel, and they act as one single vowel. So for that reason, we're still calling this a vowel and not vowels. But for this particular diphthong, it does end up farther away from vowel 2 than it started. Although for some accents, that same diphthong might actually start with the same sound as vowel 2 and therefore be transcribed like this. And then other people might not have a diphthong there at all. It'll start as the sound in vowel 1 and just not change, resulting in a pronunciation like Cregg. So when vowel 1 from Cregg version 1 has so many possible variations, the difference between that and vowel 2 in Cregg version 2 can get a lot more muddy. The final way I'm going to show that it is a subtle difference is by using a program called Praat. It's what linguists use to analyze phonetics and phonology, and it's free to download and use, so you can try this yourself, and it's pretty easy to learn. So I'm going to analyze the audio of Daniel Cregg himself saying Cregg version 1 and Cregg version 2. So we're going to open up Praat, and then at the top we click on New and record mono sound for one microphone and play back the part of Daniel Cregg himself saying both versions.
Daniel Cregg.
That is...
Yes, Daniel Cregg.
So then I'm going to take that recording, click Save to List, and then click View and Edit. And this is our spectrogram, and you can play back the whole thing to know where you are.
Daniel Cregg.
That is...
Yes, Daniel Cregg.
And I had a bit of blank space before and after, so I'm just going to select the part with the audio and click Cell, which zooms in on the selected portion.
Daniel Cregg.
That is...
Yes, Daniel Cregg.
So let's look at how he says Cregg version 2.
Cregg.
And now version 1, which he says a little bit slower, but this is his name.
Cregg.
To get a clearer look, I'll turn off the formants, which are these red dots, and we can see the dark lines beneath them.
Cregg. Cregg.
So that's vowel 2, and what we're looking at are these dark lines down here because these are the formant frequencies. You see the first one up top is kind of faint but goes a little bit up. We've got a darker one in the middle that goes slightly up, and then one down the bottom. And now for vowel 1.
A.
Once again, we've got a faint one near the top that goes a little bit up, a darker one in the middle that also goes up, and then the one near the bottom. Turning the red dots back on, the computer shows us the center of each formant line, which should make it a bit easier to visualize how they move. So again, we can see the formant on the top goes up slightly, the one in the middle also goes up slightly, and the one on the bottom drops in from the R, but then it's pretty even. And looking at vowel 2 again, we can see something that's very similar, just a little bit more condensed because he really slowed down the way he said his own name in version 1. To get a better look at Cregg versus Cregg, I'm going to make a new recording.
Cregg. 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 Cregg.
And again, save to list, view, and edit.
Cregg. 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 Cregg.
In these examples, the quickest way to tell them apart is that he said version 2 quicker than he said version 1, and therefore the slopes are steeper, but it's just because it's condensed. But if we click on a point in the spectrogram, it gives us a line across the entire thing, and we can see that that line is in the middle of one formant and goes through the middle of each formant in both versions. And this is where we can really see the difference between vowel 1 and vowel 2, because this darker formant in the middle is a little bit higher up for vowel 1, because we can see the line goes through the middle of vowel 2 but below vowel 1. And looking at the bottom format, we do see that vowel 2 is just slightly higher than vowel 1, but not by much at all. But without analyzing the frequency down to the tens place in hertz, how easy is it to tell the difference? They look very similar. The differences are definitely there, and we can look at them in detail, but I would say the differences are subtle. So between Cregg version 1 and Cregg version 2, 3 out of the 4 phonemes are exactly the same, all the consonants. The only difference is that one vowel phoneme. That one vowel is a mid-front unrounded vowel in both versions. And English has no other vowel that exists between those two. And if you look at them on a spectrogram, they are almost indistinguishable. For those reasons, I believe that the difference between the name Daniel Craig and some other name Craig is a subtle difference. Now, you might have been thinking of the word subtle as meaning two things that you really can't tell the difference between, but I would argue that nobody really uses subtle to refer to things that are truly indistinguishable, just things that are different but still quite similar. And I think I've proven that in the case of Craig versus Craig, that it is a subtle difference. And one last thing before I forget, this isn't to say that it doesn't matter if you pronounce it Cregg versus Craig. If you want a deeper look at the social implications and expectations of pronouncing names certain ways, check out this video. But this video is just to look at the phonetic differences between Cregg versus Craig. It was all in good fun. They laughed about it. You can see the full interview linked in the description. And at the end of the day, Daniel Craig is the only person who can decide how his name is pronounced.
I don't want you, Daniel Craig, mad at me. Daniel Craig? That guy, Daniel Craig. Daniel Craig, I'm so sorry. Please accept my...
But what do you guys think? Let us know in the comments. If you wrote down what you thought before, how do you feel after watching the video? And of course, if you enjoyed this video, the best way to let us know is by liking, sharing, and subscribing for more. We'd like to see you in the next one. Until then, remember, every accent, every dialect, every language, the way everybody speaks around the world are all equally valid and beautiful. Goodbye.